That is why Sudan is dying and forgotten.
Major ongoing wars in Ukraine and Gaza continue to capture most of the world's headlines. There is another third war that's just as catastrophic and consequential for the world as these other two that's going on right now in Sudan, that is nearing its one-year anniversary of beginning. Sudan has been locked in a devastating civil war ever since April of 2023, when two rival generals commanding two rival armies in the country began openly clashing and firing upon each other's forces in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum. 6.5 million people has transformed into a smoldering crater of a war zone subjected to devastating airstrikes or street-to-street combat. There are some who've even referred to Khartoum now as the Aleppo of Africa, after the biggest city in Syria that was almost completely destroyed by the fighting during the civil war in that country last decade. More than half of Khartoum's pre-war metropolitan population is believed to have fled the area for their lives, as the rival armies
third war going on in there.
Side for control. While nationwide, the United Nations estimates that at least 13,000 people have already been since the war began, while more than 10.7 million people, or more than 1 in 5 Sudanese, have been forcibly displaced from their homes. 9 million of these people are displaced within Sudan's borders, representing the largest internal displacement crisis anywhere in the world right now that's even larger than in Ukraine, while roughly 1.7 million more Sudanese have fled the country as refugees, and more are likely to continue following out of Sudan's massive internally displaced population, representing a potential cascading crisis as refugees flee into the already fragile states that surround Sudan, like Libya, Chad, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Ethiopia. All countries that are either currently trapped in their own civil wars or have had recent devastating civil wars in the past decade that could become reignited again. And what many of these Sudanese are fleeing from is not only the massive violence being waged between the two rival armies in the country, but a potentially renewed genocide that is ongoing in Sudan's perennially troubled Darfur region. Just last month, in January of 2024, a damning report made to the United Nations Security Council that is considered to be credible concluded that one of the rival armies in Sudan, known as the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF, systematically somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 people in just a single
there's a lot of people killed
in West Darfur over the summer of 2023, and forcibly drove hundreds of thousands more across the border into neighboring Chad. If that report is accurate, it potentially represents more deaths in just that one city than what the entire nationwide death toll from the war previously stood at, which implies a crisis going on in Sudan that is of a scale far worse than what most outsiders believe or know. The reports coming out of Darfur today are being further reinforced by the fact that for every 2 female refugees who have escaped across the border into Chad, only 1 male refugee has made it, which implies that the RSF has been systematically targeting men in Darfur for mass. The conflict being waged in Sudan today has evidently dumped gasoline upon the embers that were still smoldering in Darfur, left behind from the last region that largely went on between 2003 and 2005, when around 300,000 people in Darfur. And as the fires of genocide potentially rage again in Darfur today, and as the rival generals fighting for domination over the country's leadership shows no signs of stopping anytime soon, Sudan faces the genuine risk of further balkanization and separatism after the previous secession of the South a decade ago back in 2011. And as the war within Sudan rages, multiple external wars within the war are being fought by numerous outside powers that are busy transforming Sudan into one of the world's most complicated proxy battlefields.
And it's a war within the war.
Pitting the United Arab Emirates up against Saudi Arabia, Egypt against Ethiopia, Turkey against Libyan nationalists, and there are even credible reports of Ukrainian special forces fighting gun battles with Russian Wagner Group mercenaries on the streets of Khartoum that are all overlapping the primary war between the two
Wagner Group
Sudanese
still exists.
And in order to understand all of this fiendish complexity that's going on in Sudan right now, and why Sudan's fate is so important to the entire rest of the world, it helps to begin with a brief overview of how Sudan's geography and history have led to the current crisis. Sudan, you see, has been a troubled place for practically all of its history going back centuries. The country's territory exists at the crossroads of the Arab world to the north and the east, and the sub-Saharan African world to the south and the west. And this placement between these two worlds has defined Sudanese culture for ages. Between the 14th and 15th centuries, Arab nomads began migrating and settling the area of modern Sudan, which up to that point was almost entirely inhabited by African peoples, while the Ottomans ruled the east and the coast. Later on in the 19th century, most of modern-day Sudan was conquered by the Egyptians and further Arabized. And then in 1899, under pressure from the British, the Egyptians agreed to transform Sudan into an international condominium ruled jointly by themselves and the UK. The nominally independent Sultanate of Darfur, ruled by Africans, was later invaded by the British and Egyptians in 1916, conquered, and annexed into Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, which created Sudan's borders that would persist for the rest of the 20th century. Sudan would be granted its independence from the British and the Egyptians in 1956, and it would emerge as the largest country in Africa and one of the top 10 largest countries in the entire world, taking up a geographic area roughly a third of the size of the mainland continental 48 United States. And with this huge size and this location at the crossroads between the Arab and African worlds, Sudan was also one of the world's most highly diverse countries as well. It was home to nearly 600 distinctly different ethnic groups and more than 400 different languages, though Arabic was the more common lingua franca in the north and English was the more common lingua franca in the south owing to the colonial period. Sudan's northeast, based around the upper reaches of the Nile River and the country's coastline on the Red Sea, was predominantly Arab and Muslim, while the peripheral regions of the country to the west in Darfur and to the south in southern Sudan were substantially more diverse. Darfur was overwhelmingly Muslim, but largely populated by various sub-Saharan African tribal groups who were largely settled farmers, along with smaller numbers of nomadic Arab-identifying herders in the north. And on the other hand, southern Sudan was populated by hundreds of different sub-Saharan African ethnic groups who were largely not Muslim at all, and who followed either various traditional African animist faiths or Christianity. Because of these sharp internal divisions, tensions bubbled up to the surface in Sudan between the Arab-Muslim-dominated north and the ethnically and religiously distinct peripheral regions, and the country's first civil war between the north before independence was even granted. That first civil war was devastating and would last for the next 16 years until 1972. Around 1 million people were across Sudan during the war, and it ended with the north agreeing to grant the southern half of the country its political autonomy, with the establishment of the Southern Sudan Autonomous Region. However, only a decade later in 1983, under the rule of the Arab military dictator Ghaffar Mohammed al-Nimyari, Khartoum would revoke the South's hard-fought autonomous status and introduce strict Islamic Sharia law for the entire country, including within the non-Muslim, non-Arab, formerly autonomous South. This ended up leading to
Sharia law on a non-Muslim, what?
the southern half of Sudan rebelling rebelling against the government again, which led to the Second Sudanese Civil War that would last for another 22 agonizing years until 2005, in which another estimated 2 million more people across the country would be, making the wars in Sudan among the deadliest conflicts worldwide since World War II. And a huge part of the reason why the Arab-dominated Sudanese government didn't want the South to leave and was willing to pay millions of lives to keep them was because that's where most of the country's oil reserves happened to be located. Significant oil reserves had only been discovered in Sudan later on in the game by Chevron in 1978, in between the two big civil wars. And it turned out the country had similar reserves of oil as Oman or Mexico, and was a top 25 oil state worldwide. However, an overwhelming
And this is where Chevron is
95%
discovered.
of all Sudan's discovered oil reserves were in the non-Arab south of the country. And so, if the South was autonomous and kept all their oil money for themselves, then the North would never actually benefit from them. This is a huge reason why the North decided to suddenly revoke the South's autonomy only a few years after the oil was discovered there, and why the North was then willing to fight a war with millions to try and hang on to the South. But by 2005, the country was exhausted from more than 2 decades of war, and all the parties involved agreed to sign what became known as the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which established a timetable for an independence referendum to be hosted in southern Sudan. That referendum would be held a few years later in January of 2011, and it resulted in an utterly overwhelming landslide victory for the Yes campaign, with 98% of the votes choosing independence, which led to South Sudan formally seceding from the rest of the country a few months later in July of 2011 as the world's newest country. And they took 75% of Sudan's oil wealth with them in the process. But many unresolved questions between them continued to linger on. An oil-rich border region between them about the same size as Lebanon that's known as Abyei was set up by the peace as a condominium to be jointly ruled by both Sudan and South Sudan as equals. And so, both countries have continued claiming the territory for themselves that has sporadically resulted in violence. Two more highly ethnically and religiously diverse southern states that remain within Sudan, South Kordofan and Blue Nile, were supposed to also host vaguely defined popular consultations in 2011 to determine their own constitutional futures. But these popular consultations were indefinitely suspended by the government in Khartoum. And so a splinter group of the primary South Sudan People's Liberation Movement, or SPLM, that was instrumental in achieving South Sudan's independence, formed across the border in South Kordofan and Blue Nile that became known as the SPLM North. They would continue to wage a low-level insurgency against the Sudanese government in South Kordofan and Blue Nile, with demands for greater autonomy in each and a more federalized Sudanese government structure. And within only 2 years of South Sudan's independence, the world's newest country would descend into its own catastrophic civil war in 2013 that would last for 7 more years until 2020 and kill another 400,000 people. During the Second Sudanese Civil War in 1989, a charismatic Sudanese army general known as Omar al-Bashir launched a successful coup d'etat that overthrew the democratically elected government in the country, as it was attempting to negotiate with the rebels in the south. Al-Bashir was a hardline Islamist and Arab nationalist, and during his authoritarian military regime, he pursued a policy of harsh crackdowns against the non-Arab and non-Muslim rebels in the south and in Darfur. In 2003, non-Arab rebel factions in Darfur launched attacks against Sudanese military facilities in the name of greater autonomy, and al-Bashir responded with one of the 21st century's most brutal campaigns of repression. The al-Bashir regime created a militia organization out of the nomadic Arab-identifying herding peoples of northern Darfur that they called the Janjaweed, which roughly translates into English as the devils on horseback. Faced with the rebellion of the non-Arab peoples in southern and western Darfur, and faced with the parallel ecological crisis of the Sahara Desert continuing to expand southwards and pressuring their migration southward, the Janjaweed rolled across southern and western Darfur with their horses and their guns, and burned hundreds of African villages to the ground and around 300,000 people within only 2 years of unprecedented violence between 2003 and
2 years is there's a lot.
2005. Actions that have been labeled by the United States government and by multiple UN agencies. Millions more were forcibly displaced by the violence in Darfur in the 2000s, and the International Criminal Court, or ICC in The Hague, would take the unprecedented step of issuing multiple arrest warrants for Omar al-Bashir in 2009 and again in 2010 on charges of crimes against humanity and genocide for his government's actions in Darfur, which made al-Bashir the first sitting head of state to ever be ordered arrested by the ICC in its history. Al-Bashir and his regime naturally rejected the ICC's jurisdiction in Sudan and refused to cooperate with the warrant, which continued to fuel al-Bashir's own dictatorial paranoia. He expelled NGOs from the country like Doctors Without Borders and the UN World
Yeah, this like happened like 10 years ago,
Program, accusing them of spying in the
like
country.
20 years ago.
On behalf of the ICC, while financial sanctions slapped on Sudan by the United States were continuing to bite him in his economy even further. Sudan and the United States had had a fraught relationship pretty much ever since he had assumed power. His Islamist ideology led him to host Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda in the country up until 1996, which led to Washington designating Sudan as a state sponsor of terrorism and introducing comprehensive sanctions against Sudan in 1997. These at the United States embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998 that hundreds resulted in the United States retaliating by firing cruise missiles at alleged al-Qaeda targets that were still operating in Sudan. Even harsher economic and trade sanctions were applied by the United States on Sudan, following Washington's accusations of the regime carrying it in Darfur in the 2000s. And after the loss of 75% of the country's oil reserves with the South's independence in 2011, the Sudanese economy was being relentlessly battered, and it crashed by 17% in 2012 alone. Fearful of the struggling economy and the South's independence negatively impacting his domestic popularity, and fearful of the ICC's active arrest warrant for him, al-Bashir grew increasingly paranoid that the military would eventually conspire to overthrow him, just like how he had overthrown the previous government that had came before him. This led to him establishing a system of supposedly coup-proofing himself in Sudan, with the creation of 2 parallel military structures within the country: the primary Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, that were placed under the command of General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the creation of a new paramilitary force titled Janjaweed militias from Darfur, that evolved into the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF, under the command of rival General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, better known by his nom de guerre, Hamedi. For years across the 2010s, the RSF continued carrying out violent pogroms against Darfur's non-Arab populations to try and keep Darfuri rebel activity suppressed, and they served as a mercenary group for hire in multiple external conflicts beyond Sudan's borders. RSF troops traveled to neighboring Libya to fight on behalf of the warlord Khalifa Haftar's Tobruk-based government during the civil war there, while thousands of other RSF fighters were contracted by the United Arab Emirates and transported to Yemen to fight for the Emiratis' interests in the civil war there as well. Al-Bashir's intentions within Sudan were to always play the ambitions of the SAF and the RSF.
Yeah, I can show this things.
In order to keep them both too busy and occupied with each other to ever be able to collaborate together in overthrowing him. But all of that suddenly changed in 2019. The Sudanese economy was beginning to shrink again, with negative growth in GDP in both 2018 and 2019. And frustrated with the worsening economy and al-Bashir's continued 3-decade-long authoritarian rule, popular protests and uprisings against him began forming in Khartoum. They began demanding his resignation and greater democracy. And as the protests grew larger, the rival generals al-Burhan and Hamedi of the SAF and the RSF, who were supposed to always be struggling against one another, actually decided to collaborate together and launched a joint coup d'etat that finally overthrew al-Bashir from power. And in the aftermath, they set up what they claimed was only a temporary military administration that would eventually transition Sudan back towards a civilian-led democratic democratic government, which the country hadn't known ever since the 1980s. A man named Abdallah Hamdok was quickly appointed as Sudan's new interim civilian prime minister until the elections could take place at an undetermined future date. But then he was also really quickly forcibly removed from office and kidnapped by the SAF and the RSF during another military coup in October of 2021, when they
Okay, that was quick.
suspended the constitution. Civilian protests against Sudan's military leadership erupted again, while the IMF and the World Bank suspended their debt relief programs to Sudan in response, worsening Sudan's financial crisis even further. The civilian prime minister, Hamdok, was briefly reinstated to his position by the military the following month in November, but then he almost immediately resigned in January of 2022 as the anti-military protests continued, and as the military continued repressing them with ever-increasing violence. Al-Burhan and Hemedti and their rival armies were then left over as Sudan's de facto joint leaders. But pressure from Sudan's civilian population and protests were growing on them to finally commit to a timetable of fully transitioning back to civilian rule. In December of 2022, they agreed on a deal that established a 2-year timeline for nationwide elections that would finally establish the civilian leadership. But the deal also laid out the groundwork for Hemedti's RSF army to become absorbed and integrated into the primary SAF army that was led by Al-Burhan. And critically, the deal didn't actually specify a clear timeline for any of this to actually take place. Al-Burhan was evidently insisting on a shorter 2-year timeline for the RSF to become fully integrated into the SAF under his command, while Hemedti was counter-insisting on a much more drawn-out 10-year process to do so. Tensions between both sides continued growing, with Hemedti seemingly unwilling to give up his army quickly, and with both generals wary of giving up any of their power to a future civilian government. The tensions finally reached a boiling point, and gunfire and explosions rang out across Khartoum. The SAF and the RSF each blamed each other for firing the first shot, and the newest civil war in Sudan had begun. Both sides began the civil war with similar numbers of manpower at their disposal. The RSF consisted of more veteran fighters with recent combat experience serving as mercenaries in the civil wars in Libya and Yemen. But as a paramilitary militia, they lacked the air power and armor that the primary SAF had under their command. For nearly a year now since the war began, both the SAF and the RSF have been openly battling against one another all across the country for the ultimate control of Sudan, while the RSF has been increasingly gaining the momentum. They've managed to capture most of the capital city, including Sudan's only oil refinery and Khartoum's international airport, which prompted the SAF to withdraw their headquarters from the capital and relocate further behind the front line in Port Sudan on the Red Sea.
Yeah, still happening there.
The RSF have captured virtually every major city in the Darfur area, and in December of 2023, they overran the major city of Wad Madani to the southeast of Khartoum, which had a pre-war population of more than 330,000 people. And as the successors to the Janjaweed that carried out the US in Darfur in the early 2000s, the RSF have begun committing similar atrocities in Darfur today, after several Darfuri rebel factions announced their support for the SAF and Al-Burhan. Multiple large-scale massacres of Africans by RSF forces in Darfur have been reported, which has led the United States to publicly accuse the RSF of war crimes and ethnic cleansing. But the United States has also accused the SAF of committing war crimes during the conflict too. Faced with the more experienced fighters in the SAF has resorted to their superior air power to bomb RSF positions from the sky, and they frequently carried out indiscriminate airstrikes of civilian populated areas in the name of attacking the RSF and their supply lines. And the RSF has been continuing to swell their numbers because they're attracting large numbers of volunteers from thousands of miles away. When you look in northern Africa through the lens of ethnicity, you will see a nearly continuous belt of Arab-identifying tribes that extends westward from Sudan and Darfur through Chad and Niger, and then into Mali and Mauritania. Hemedti, as a member of one of these Arab-identifying tribes himself, has made strategic alliances and overtures to many of these other tribes spanning all the way to the Atlantic. And thousands of men from these regions have flocked to join the RSF in its active fights in Sudan and in Darfur. Many of them are coming for loot and plunder, as cars and other valuable goods are stolen in Sudan during their raids and then transported westward across the Sahel and resold to unsuspecting buyers in so-called Dagalo markets, named after Hamdan Dagalo himself. And unlike the Janjaweed of the past, who largely carried out their atrocities in Darfur with horses and AK-47s, the RSF of today are acquiring very heavy advanced weapons to help them in their war this time around, like anti-tank weapons, surface-to-air missiles, machine guns, and grenade launchers because of all the different proxy wars that are taking place in Sudan, atop of the war between the RSF and the SAF. First and foremost is the struggle for supremacy in Sudan that is ongoing between the rival royal families of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Both are major investors in the Sudanese economy, with substantial assets they stand to lose if the side they don't want to win comes out on top. The Emirates have already invested more than $13 billion into the country, while the Saudis announced in 2022 before the war began that they would invest up to $24 billion into the country as well. Sudan is, after all, a very valuable piece on the board in the United Arab Emirates' grander geopolitical objectives around the Red Sea. Abu Dhabi and Riyadh are each actively competing against the other to become the leading Arab and Persian Gulf state. Though the UAE only has a fourth of Saudi Arabia's population, the Emirates have an economy that punches far above their weight that's about half the size of the Saudis, and the two are the leading economic powers in the Arab world. The Saudis dominate the eastern shore of the Red Sea with their own shoreline, one of the most critical shipping routes in the
1 trillion GDP.
world, with the Suez Canal to the north and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait to the south. The UAE has therefore spent years attempting to build up their position and influence around the Red Sea's shores, to challenge Saudi hegemony in the area, by backing the secessionist Southern Transitional Council in Yemen against the Saudi-backed government and Iranian-backed Houthis, and by building up military bases on the Yemeni islands of Socotra and Perim, by investing hundreds of millions of dollars into developing the port of Berbera nearby to the Red Sea in the breakaway state of Somaliland, by supporting the government of Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia, and by cultivating ties to the RSF and Hemedti in Sudan, whose fighters the UAE used in Yemen and fought alongside of in Libya before the war in Sudan even began. The UAE then quickly chose to back Hemedti and the RSF in Sudan once the war began, hoping that an outright RSF victory in the country would cement their growing geopolitical influence and clout in the Red Sea region at the expense of the Saudis. And although Abu Dhabi denies it, there is credible evidence that the UAE has been supplying the RSF with massive quantities of weapons. A report from the Wall Street Journal showed several dozen armed deliveries that the UAE made to the RSF after the war began through the airport of Amjaras just across the border in Chad, while the UAE is further giving the RSF access to their banks and financial system so they can skirt around US sanctions in exchange for Emirati access to the RSF's controlled gold mines and oil fields in Sudan. Khalifa Haftar, the warlord who rules the eastern half of Libya, that the UAE and the RSF both supported for years during the Libyan civil war, has also apparently decided on returning the favor by opening up the stockpiles of the previous Gaddafi regime in Libya to the RSF. That has included anti-tank weapons in addition to convoys carrying Libyan oil to power the RSF's vehicles. And in addition to the military support they're receiving from the UAE and from Haftar's Libya, and from thousands of volunteers who are coming from all across the Sahel, Hemedti and the RSF are also receiving significant military support from Russia's paramilitary Wagner Group as well. The Wagner Group has been known to have had a presence within Sudan since at least 2017, as a mercenary group for hire. Wagner soldiers were contracted in Sudan to guard valuable gold mines in the unstable Darfur region, and they brought in Russian weaponry in exchange for Sudanese gold. The Wagner Group fought in Libya for the Haftar regime in the east alongside the RSF and the UAE. And after Russia's invasion of Ukraine began in February of 2022, Wagner's operations in Sudan became even more critical to the Russian government. Sudan is the world's 10th largest producer of gold, with extensive gold mines found found all across the country, but particularly in Darfur, that was under the influence of the RSF. Perhaps
So
anticipating
organizes to protect the gold.
their future increased need for Sudanese gold, Hamedi himself was in Moscow the very day the Russians invaded Ukraine signing paperwork. After the United States and the European Union and other Western countries severed the Russians from their financial systems following the invasion, the Russians began having to turn to more alternative and covert methods of funding their army in Ukraine, like by securing more untraceable gold from places like Sudan. Within the first year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine beginning, the Wagner Group and their affiliates are believed to have managed to covertly smuggle nearly $2 billion worth of gold out of Sudan to help finance their army. And they've almost certainly smuggled billions more since the war in Sudan between Hamedi and al-Burhan began, which led to the Russians more firmly cementing their alliance with the RSF. Hamedi's forces currently control most of the country's gold trade, and they've been able to essentially trade billions of dollars worth of gold to the Wagner Group that is then smuggled back to Russia in exchange for advanced Russian weaponry, like surface-to-air missiles, howitzers, and multiple rocket launchers, in addition to Wagner troops themselves serving as mercenaries. As weapons from the United Arab Emirates are allegedly entering into the RSF's hands from across the border in Chad, Russian weaponry is also allegedly entering into their hands at the same time through the Wagner Group's parallel operations in the Central African Republic and in Libya. Russia is interested in an RSF victory in Sudan to secure continued access to their gold that will help them further circumvent Western economic sanctions and to eventually establish a Russian naval base on Sudan's coast on the Red Sea, a long-time objective of the Kremlin's that would add increased security along their own oil export route towards their biggest customers in India and China. If the RSF emerges victorious in Sudan, they would be likely to reward the Russians for their heavy support in the aftermath. And for these reasons, the Russian and Emirati foreign policies are directly aligned in Sudan, which is probably part of the reason why Vladimir Putin himself made an official visit to the United Arab Emirates in December of 2023 to coordinate their strategies, where he was welcomed with the highest levels of pomp and circumstance by Abu Dhabi. And it's also why credible reports emerged this month in February of Ukrainian special forces being present in Sudan fighting Wagner troops as they attempt to sever Russia's gold trade with the country that is helping to finance their war machine. The war is also causing a tremendous amount of instability to the south and South Sudan as well. South Sudan may have taken the vast majority of the country's oil reserves with them back in 2011, but the country remained entirely dependent upon Sudan for their ability to actually export any of their oil to global markets. South Sudan is landlocked, and a pipeline constructed in the 1990s known as the Greater Nile
Yeah,
Oil
they can export the gold
their oil fields in Port Sudan on the Red Sea
and the oils.
remained their only viable way to transport large amounts of oil to global markets. The pipeline passes directly through the Sudanese capital city of Khartoum, that's also home to the country's only oil refinery, and which has been a catastrophically violent war zone for nearly an entire year now, which has been severely
And
disrupted.
if you cut off the export route, then what's the point of
South
having?
Sudan's ability to export their oil and earn any money. This has led to proposals to construct a new oil pipeline from South Sudan's fields that'll run through Ethiopia instead towards the port of Djibouti. But this is also potentially problematic, because Ethiopia isn't really that much more stable than Sudan is, with its own active civil war and armed rebellions continuing. They could threaten the new pipeline's viability too. The SPLM North rebel group that's active in Sudan, South Kordofan, and Blue Nile states has escalated its insurgency into a full-scale rebellion since the war began as well, with some of its members even advocating for further partitions of Sudan, either in the form of South Kordofan and Blue Nile's outright independence or union with South Sudan, while violence between Sudanese and South Sudanese forces have further escalated over the contested oil-rich Abyei region further to the west as well, with its ultimate status between them still being undetermined. There's now an increasing degree of concern of Sudan devolving into either a Libya scenario, with the capital in the country west of the Nile River falling under the control of Hamedi and the RSF, and the territory east of the Nile and along the coastline falling under the control of al-Burhan and the SAF, or a further Balkanization scenario for Sudan in which the country could further collapse along ethnic and religious lines, not only in South Kordofan and Blue Nile, but in Darfur as well, which was a nominally independent sultanate until the early 20th century when it was conquered and absorbed into Sudan. A combination of the Libya and Balkanization scenarios for Sudan are also possible too, as is a complete takeover by either Hamedi or al-Burhan and their proxy supporters. An increased refugee surges into neighboring fragile states like Ethiopia, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, Chad, and Libya stand to exacerbate or trigger additional conflicts in Africa in a cascading domino effect of war. And Washington is growing increasingly frustrated with this uncertain situation and worsening instability in Sudan. So far, all peace and ceasefire negotiations and attempts in Sudan between the rival generals and their proxy supporters have failed. Washington definitely doesn't want an outright RSF victory in Sudan due to fears that an RSF-dominated Sudan would become a pro-Russian pariah state in Africa like Syria is in the Middle East, and they would continue funneling gold to Moscow to continue undermining the West's sanctions on Russia, and probably allow a Russian port to be established on the Red Sea too. The United States is trying to convince the UAE to abandon their support for the RSF in order to help avoid this outcome, but they aren't very likely to be successful because of how close the US-UAE relationship is outside of Sudan. The UAE has been the most significant Arab state to normalize its relations with Israel since the Abraham Accords began in 2020, and owing to its high degree of influence and investment in the country, the UAE was further instrumental in securing Sudan's subsequent normalization with Israel in 2021, which curried a huge degree of favor towards the UAE and Washington. The UAE is also one of Washington's largest customers for the American arms industry, worth tens of billions of dollars. Abu Dhabi agreed on a deal with the previous Trump administration to purchase a whopping $23 billion worth of American military hardware that included 50 cutting-edge F-35 fighter jets and 18 MQ-9 Reaper drones, even though the Biden administration later paused the deal for review. The United States also maintains a major Air Force base in the UAE at Al Dhafra that's home to around 5,000 American military personnel that proved critical to supporting America's wars against ISIS in Iraq and Syria and against the Taliban in Afghanistan, convincing the United Arab Emirates to abandon its support for the
Yeah,
RSF.
America's armies everywhere.
Sudan would be a tough sell, as it would compromise on Abu Dhabi's ambitions to become the new hegemon in the Red Sea at the expense of Saudi Arabia. And the United States doesn't want to alienate the United Arab Emirates too much because of all of their cooperation with Israel, their shared antagonism towards Iran, and huge arms purchases, not to even mention the fact that the UAE is also the 8th largest oil producer in the world and can significantly affect the global price of oil in America's favor by choosing to either cut or raise production. Nonetheless, there are increasing calls within Washington for the United States to begin quietly supporting the SAF and al-Burhan in the country anyway, to destroy the Russian gold smuggling route, to begin bringing some kind of stability back to Sudan and the increasingly chaotic Red Sea region that threatens U.S. allies in the region like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and to bring a halt to the RSF's apparent ethnic cleansing and potentially genocidal campaign of annihilation being waged across Darfur. Because of how remote and undeveloped of a region Darfur is, and how few people there actually have access to the internet or other telecommunications, and because of the nature of the fog of war, nobody really knows exactly what's been going on there or how many people have died since the RSF overran the area. But there is that United
Well,
Nations
this is unlucky.
report that estimates as many as 15,000 people in the city of El Janina alone. Satellite images have revealed dozens of villages that have been
Yeah, I don't think I can go beyond this. I think it's only the monetizable content. They're updating that.